My Java and AI book went out for its first tech review. A bit about context caching with Gemini, the greatest organ piece ever written, and the usual collection of silly tweets and toots. Welcome to Tales from the Jar Side. The subtitle this week is Solar Energy is Just Nuclear Energy from a Safe Distance. Think about it. Yeah, welcome to Tales from the Jar Side. My name is Ken Cousin. This is my free weekly newsletter video version. On Tales from the Jar Side, try to help you understand what's going on in the IT world, what parts of it are worth learning about, and what parts really aren't. This week, I started off with the normal reminders, by the way, that regular readers of and listeners to, and of course, video viewers of this newsletter are affectionately known as jarheads and are far more intelligent, sophisticated, and of course, attractive than the average newsletter reader or listener or viewer. If you wish to become a jarhead, please subscribe using the button on the newsletter or, of course, on the YouTube channel. Now, the first section is about my upcoming book, which I've mentioned a couple of times. It has the working title, Adding AI to Java. We'll see what the title eventually is, but that's the basic concept. So there are 9 chapters planned, and 5 of them just went out for the first tech review. Now, there's another chapter that's basically done, and another chapter that's about maybe 2/3 of the way finished, and then we'll see how they go. I've got a bit of a summary here, just to give you an idea. The first chapter is a getting started one with a simple demo and a review of the cool features in Java that have been added since version 8. The second one talks about basic chat with Java and JSON. I use Mistral and OpenAI for the demos. The next chapter does the same sort of thing, but with the Spring framework as the primary mechanism. Then we install and use AI models through the Ollama system, so they're running on your local machine. And that's also where we get to work with a lot of these alternate models, Llama 3, Gemma, Phi, a bunch of the open weights models, as they say, or open sourced, if you will. Then we start getting really interesting with the so-called vision models. A vision model is a model where you upload an image and it interprets what's in it or identifies various objects, things like that. And I've been finding that more and more useful as time has gone on. That's also where we introduce the idea of data-oriented programming, where you use records and sealed interfaces and pattern matching for switch in order to make more powerful, more robust systems. The rest of the chapters, the next one's on generating images, and I've already got some stuff about DALL-E 3 and Stable Diffusion in there, trying to decide how much to include of alternatives like Midjourney. Midjourney is notorious for not having an API, but there are ways to get around that, and it may be worth talking about. The chapter that I've completed that haven't really added to the system yet is the one on audio. So it's text to audio, where you put in text and it generates an MP3 for you, and also audio to text. And that's either doing what they call transcription. It takes the audio and transcribes it for you, or it is translation, where it will translate audio into English. That's the only one that's supported at the moment. So we got a section on that. The chapter after that is on the various Java frameworks, things like LangChain for J and Spring AI. Those are both pre-version 1, so we don't really know what the form of that's going to be in the long run. Version 1 things have a tendency to change a lot, so I'm stalling on that chapter. I'm think I'm going to look at Semantic Kernel, the one from Microsoft, and see how that works. But again, we've got to be careful with those because they're subject to extensive changes in the relatively near future. Still, they are arguably the future. They're all promising and very easy to use. The last chapter will talk about adding your own data. That'll be the one on retrieval augmented generation, the so-called RAG approach, as well as large context windows. That'll be in the next section. And maybe some other alternative things that'll be worth talking about, like what you can do with these incredibly large context windows these days. So we'll get to that. I don't want to do that without one of the frameworks, though, because while you can do some of those things, what I would argue manually with the simple API calls, in fact, the frameworks make it much easier to manage those systems. And therefore, I'd like to talk about the frameworks first and then address that through the framework perspective. I would like to have the book complete this summer. Ideally, I want the text to be finished in August. If I can get it finished earlier than that, so much the better. Then UberConf is like the second or third week in July. I'd love to have the book in beta by then. We'll see. There's things in that I don't have control over, so we'll have to see how that goes. Next section. This idea of caching the context window, turns out Gemini, which has always been the champion on the amount of context available to it. What I mean by context is that when you're conversing with an AI tool, it only remembers what you tell it in that particular message. It doesn't remember from message to message. Now, when you use it through the websites, then it seems to have a memory, but that's because they wrote it that way. They basically take the earlier questions and responses and add it to the current question and response so that it's seeing it over again. But there's a limit to how much you can do on that. How many questions and answers can it remember? This is generally measured in what they call tokens. A token being a portion of a word. The rough percentage, I think, the way to think about it is that 1,000 tokens is about 750 words. And this is an average. If you're thinking in terms of how big a prompt you're putting in, you don't normally put in a prompt that's 1,000 words in it or even 750 words in it, but you could. It depends on how many examples you want to provide and how much guidance you want to give. This whole area they call prompt engineering winds up with larger and larger input prompts for your system. The token limit on your context window used to be like 4K, basically, or 8K, and maybe you'd pay extra and get 32K. Claude raised that to 100K, which was pretty cool, and then OpenAI jumped to 128K, and then I think Claude jumped to 200K, although I'm not sure that's available everywhere. Gemini raised the bar, the one from Google. They made it so you had 1 million tokens in the context window. Now, it still takes time to process all that, and tokens cost money. Not a lot of money unless you are doing lots and lots of requests all day long. For a typical developer, tokens are a fraction of a cent. You could code back and forth a dozen requests with all this stuff accumulating and still have trouble spending a nickel. It's really inexpensive here for an individual developer. It's when you put it in production with tens of thousands of users 24/7 that the costs add up. At any rate, Gemini had 1 million tokens, and now they've raised that to 2 million tokens. And while it takes time to process that, it's really beneficial. Now, what you would like is not to have to submit the same 2 million tokens with every request, or 1 million tokens with every request. If you're going to upload a book, or you're going to upload a video and have it figure out what's going on in a video, then that takes a lot of space, and you don't want to do it over and over again. So the idea of caching, C-A-C-H-E, caching the context window is very appealing. A couple of the AI tools have this capability, but the only one I've seen it in so far, and the one I really wanted to use it with, is Gemini. If you're going to put in an entire book, you'd like to be able to ask multiple questions about that without having to resubmit the book each individual time. Now, Gemini comes with a Python API and a JavaScript API based on Node. But of course, I want to do Java here. And in order to do that, what I need is a REST API. And it took some doing, but eventually getting through the documentation helped me figure out how to work with their REST API in order to cache some features in the context window. I spent days on it and couldn't get it to work, mostly because the documentation is so poor on that. And the error messages were so bad as well. Like, it would tell me it was wrong, but it wouldn't tell me how. And eventually I managed to work with Spring in order to get error messages that said, oh, you left out this required element, or the value of this element can only be this or this, and you've got to put in one of those. Things like that were not obvious from the documentation. They make sense to me now. And to make matters worse, there was nothing in the documentation I could find specifically on how to do it. So I actually went to Gemini itself in a web page and said, hey, is there any way to do this? And it said, oh yeah, here it's an undocumented feature, and it tried to lay out how to do it. And I got all my hopes up. And of course, the API it suggested was a hallucination. It didn't exist, or it didn't work the way it suggested anyway. So finally, after going on in the Discord server and asking some questions there, as of today, a couple hours ago, I actually got this to work. So clearly that's going to have to be an upcoming video. I would imagine eventually they will clean up the docs and clean up the API, and maybe the frameworks will incorporate it. But that's another reason to know how to do this by hand, just so you don't have to wait around for the framework to decide something's important and dedicate the resources necessary to get it. So that's coming. Okay, let's move on to our next section. This was totally at random, totally different, on what I happen to believe is the greatest piece of organ music that was ever composed, ever. And yeah, that's a bold statement. And as I acknowledge here, I'm not remotely qualified to make a statement like that. On the other hand, I have been listening to music, classical music and organ music specifically, off and on for decades. Although, again, I don't want to overrate that. I'm not a musician, or at least not in that sense. I don't have any training in that formally, minimal. So I don't want to oversell it, but clickbaity title, I went with it. I do have a favorite, however, and that's what I want to talk about here. Now, of course, this is any organ piece that's going to be a favorite. It's probably by Johann Sebastian Bach, and of course it is. His most famous work, the one everybody knows, is the Toccata and Fugue in D minor, and everybody knows that one from the first handful of notes. Also, in people in my generation, that's always associated with the old Rollerball movie. Rollerball being the movie that starred James Caan after his tour de force in The Godfather. He played Jonathan E., and there was a game that was fought basically to the death in many ways. It was to keep the public entertained so that the actual decision makers could make decisions. And it's dark, it's dystopian, but entertaining anyway. And that movie is the opening theme song, and big deal. It's probably worth a visit. They remade it, from what I understand, very badly, and I never watched the remake. But okay, that's the most famous Bach organ piece ever, the Toccata and Fugue in D minor. But I'm going to move on from that. Now, again, some of the classical pieces are famous because of movie tie-ins. I mean, everybody knows the 2001 The Space Odyssey one, which of course is Thus, or in German, Also sprach Zarathustra, the very famous piece there. Come on, I'm waiting for it to kick in. I'm going to talk over it a little bit so that we don't get a copyright strike or anything. And of course, and then the drums kick in. Everybody knows that one. And there I managed to find a YouTube snippet just to show that part. Hopefully that'll be fine. But now to get to the one that I really love. And I like to think I love to picture this, that Bach himself is walking into some Gothic cathedral in the early 1700s. So we're talking, I don't know, late, early Victorian age kind of thing. At any rate, early 1700s, and he's in Germany, and there's this massive organ there, and the people who maintain the organ are terrified because they know Bach is going to just attack and put it through its paces and everything. And of course, it's either dark or growing dusk, and everything's just lit by candles. Real Phantom of the Opera vibes. And he sits down at the organ and he pulls out all the stops, both literally and figuratively, on that, and starts kicking into this. And again, I'll play just the basic theme so you get the idea and talk over it a little bit here. Yeah, so this was one of about half a dozen that I have in a playlist. And they're all great, you know. Hopefully you can hear that. It gets a lot louder. So at any rate, you see the name is the Passacaglia and Fugue in C minor, or as the designation goes, BWV 582. And it's just wonderful. And from this little beginning, it just grows and grows and grows. And it's just magnificent. I love it. I'm going to stop now. Let me let the phrase finish. And then there's variation after variation after variation, and bigger, more harmony, and things move from the pedals to one keyboard and then to the other keyboard and back again. And it's just great. And then about 2/3 of the way through, I think the fugue kicks in, which is a very formal structure, but then it's the same theme involved in the fugue as in the main piece. And you're glad because it just ties everything together so well, and eventually grows to this fantastic ending where there's actually a stop for a brief moment and then kicks in again just to go through the whole thing. And I just imagine this happening in this old cathedral. And I don't know whether the onlookers break into applause or tears or both, but I've loved this forever. Now, I do have a little bit of a story about it. When I first heard this, I was a freshman in college, and one of our dorm mates, one of the people in the dorm, had this extremely expensive turntable. I seem to remember it being $700 as a turntable, and we used to make a reference to that all the time, Sook's $700 turntable. I don't know if that's true anymore, but it's a long time ago, but I think that's what we said at the time. And I wanted him to play something that showed me why you want a turntable that was that fancy. What demonstrated how good that was, and he put a recording of that on. I don't remember who the organist was. I haven't gone digging in to see if I could find a 40-year-old recording on YouTube or on some music service or something like that. But boy, it was so good. And it's long. The thing is about 13 and a half minutes, I think, something like that, maybe closer to 14. And it was worth every second. I loved it. And I kept going into his room every couple of days. Hey, play it again, play it, until he kicked me out. But all I had at the time was, believe it or not, an 8-track tape player. I put a picture in the newsletter of an 8-track tape player if you've never seen one. I think mine had speakers attached to it too. It was vaguely like this. I think it's funny that the one I found on, just by Googling, had an old 8-track of Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder. And yeah, that's totally appropriate. That would be exactly the right 8-track to include in there. They played from channel to channel. There were generally 4 channels, and then in between each channel, you'd hear this thunk as it skipped to the next one. But it would go from the 4th channel back to the 1st, and therefore was always on a loop. And if you wanted to not have to get up and go reset the needle on the record player, this is what you had. And I had a really cheap one. I did have a turntable too eventually, but it was so cheap that I'd probably call it a record player. Sook, in addition to having his expensive turntable, had one of these static guns. And he fired it up, and he would, whenever he put a new album on, he would aim the static gun at it. I'm not even sure why. Hang on a second. Let's ask ChatGPT. So I'm putting in the question, why do you use a static gun on a vinyl record? And the answer is, it's primarily for the purpose of reducing or eliminating static electricity, of course. Dust attraction. Yeah, vinyl records can attract dust and other small particles due to static electricity. Okay, it gets lodged in the grooves of the record, causing noises, pops, clicks during playback. Okay. Ease of handling can make records cling to surfaces or your hands, making them harder to handle safely. I don't know. Improve the sound quality. That could be. Static can cause audible interference during playback. Protection of equipment. Excess static electricity can potentially damage sensitive audio equipment over time. All right, there you go. That's what AI tools are for, right? It's to answer silly questions like that. So he had it, and of course he'd be wandering around the hallway with the little static gun. Didn't make any noise. He would just pull the trigger. Next door to Sook was Ron Whitaker. I seem to remember we called him the franchise. He was the best athlete we had in the dorm. And he was sitting at his stereo with his headphones on, just bopping around, his head bouncing and everything, and paying any attention to anything outside his room. Had the door open, though, and Sook wandered in and wandered up to the stereo and pulled the trigger on his static gun. And there was a little spark that went across, and of course, the thing died immediately. He basically had fried every chip in the stereo, which of course is even funnier because Sook was an electrical engineer. He knew exactly what he'd done. His electrical engineering major. Yeah, he'd put some huge voltage with no current at all kind of thing. That's how it gets rid of the static. And it's just amazing. And of course, Ron was like, what? And he looks up and Sook says, oops. And then says to him, yeah, I'll pay for it. I'll buy a new one. And Ron takes off his headphones and says, yes, you will. And Of course, when we heard about it, we've been laughing about it ever since. It was really great. That's the first time I heard the Bach's Passacaglia Fugue in C minor, and it's just wonderful. And every few years, I'll run into it again. Speaking of The Godfather, by the way, which I mentioned, there's actually in the baptism scene at the end, there's a snippet of it that plays during that scene. He played several different organ pieces, but that's one in there too. And of course, I caught it immediately. If you don't like classical music or you think there's nothing in classical music for you, then I'd say give this one a shot. Turn it up loud, play it in a place where you can just enjoy and let it wash over you. If you don't like that, you don't like organ music at all, period. Let's go to our tweets. We had a couple of tornado warnings over the weekend. We did finally lose power yesterday. That was due to a downed tree that took out a power line, but they eventually got it fixed. Or I don't know the details. It's just that's what the app reported was the problem. But here from one of our local weather forecasters, it's a great shot of a tornado warned storm in downtown Hartford a bit ago. Thankfully, no reports of damage. We did not see a funnel on our cameras, but there was a whole series of them. You know what? And as I say here, there's a reason that the Wizard of Oz is not set in Connecticut. It's set in Kansas. We're not supposed to have tornado warnings in Connecticut. That's not something that happens up here. We get an occasional hurricane. Sure, maybe once every couple of years we'll get a big one, but not like that. But it's almost like somebody's, I don't know, changed the climate or something. Yeah, okay. This one was from my friend Venkat Subramaniam. Had a little image here that said, I see that Devox Poland has successfully cloned me, and you see him here, and apparently this little reflection, although, yeah, it looks like Venkat's been cloned. And yeah, all right, maybe that's how he accomplishes 3 times as much as everybody else. But I'm not sure the world is ready for multiple Venkats or even those multiple glorious mustaches. So another item that happened this week is Willie Mays passed away, the Say Hey Kid. There were many eulogies for him. Randy Jazierli wrote an article for The Ringer, and he tweeted that it's been a long time since I stayed up until 3 a.m. on a weeknight to write a column. It's been a long time, over 4 years, since I wrote a column about baseball, period. But for Willie Mays, it was worth it as the greatest baseball player who ever lived. There's strong arguments in favor of him being the 5-tool player who was the best at all 5. It's just amazing what kind of talent and skills he had. I honestly was surprised to hear he was still alive. I guess I knew that he hadn't passed away because it would be a big deal when he did, but I hadn't thought about him in a long time. I never saw him play. I think he retired in the early 70s after those couple of years for the Mets that were not good. And I was not really a baseball person when I was 7, 8 years old, something like that. Not really. I lived in Baltimore during the heyday of the Earl Weaver Orioles. So I really enjoyed the Orioles locally, and they lost to the Mets in '69, which really upset me. I was 7. But I don't remember much about Willie Mays. On the other hand, the first baseball biography I ever read was a bio written for kids called The Say Hey Kid. I haven't even looked for it since then, but I remember reading about him, and I remembered that in the minors he hit .477, which is why they had to call him up. And he didn't think he was ready, and they said, what's your batting average? It's .470. Get up here. And that he was like 1 for his first 23 or something, and then hit the cover off the ball the whole rest of the year, made Rookie of the Year and never looked back. Just an incredible guy. And I also remember the story that he did get a tryout from the Red Sox. So did a couple other major players, got tryouts for the Red Sox. Maybe even Jackie Robinson might have been one of them. But the ownership was so racist at the time that they didn't even give it a thought. It was never a possibility. They were just going to play for them. They made up some curse of the Bambino after selling Babe Ruth to the Yankees in 19 or whatever. That's why they lost for decades. That's not why they lost for decades. They lost for decades because they wouldn't play anybody but white male, by the traditional guys. The racism kept them down as the rest of the league integrated. I know that came much later, but the same idea, though. I mean, it's just, of course they were terrible until the 60s when they finally started to integrate. Just awful. This was a quick reminder from Lisa Simpson. None of your problems are because someone is trans. None. Yeah, okay, you tell them, Lisa. This I thought was great. It was a little cartoon. See if I can magnify that. It said, we stopped production. It would be totally illogical to make more than one. And if you dig in, you can see there's a little mug there that says world's greatest dad. So yeah, why would you make more than one, right? Otherwise, they're not great. That's what always bugs me about in IT when we refer to best practices. They're not best, they're common. They're popular or approved. If they're best, then why would you ever do anything different? And of course, they all need to be customized to your environment. They all need to be tuned to work with your circumstances, your data, your situation. They're not best. At any rate, this one was another great image. It said 3 unread messages, and they've got 3 pigeons in the little case back there. I don't know. I think those may be on the way out rather than on the way in, but okay, it was funny anyway. This one was Theater Kids Beware. Elle put up another great one. She said, oh, that one doesn't get any bigger. Okay. A ruthless predator. Alligators will sometimes use jazz hands to lure musical theater people to their deaths. And big spread out hands there. I couldn't think of anything funny to add to that. I just thought that was great. This one was another post on Mastodon, said, right now the need for blood is rising, and they put a little girl there, and the comment was, I'm sorry, but vampire babies are just too adorable. I'm going to clean that up a little bit, which I thought was funny. And speaking of vampires, this one was a series of posts. Wait, if vampires don't need air, they'd be awesome scuba divers. They could just wear a backpack full of rocks and walk on the bottom. And if they dive deep enough, light won't even reach down there. It's like aquatic vampire covens. Covens? I don't know about covens, but at any rate, at the bottom of the ocean trenches. And finally, don't underwater cave dive. It's too dangerous. Why? Would I get lost and drown? No, scuba vamp. I thought that was great. Good argument. And finally, this one that said, as a programmer, I'll likely be making off-by-1 mistakes until the day after I die. Yes. I used to think my middle name was off by 1 error, so yeah, I totally sympathize. Have a great week, everybody. I'll be finishing up my Spring in 3 Weeks course on the O'Reilly Learning Platform, and then I'll be moving on and hopefully making more progress on the book and making another video. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to everybody again next week. Take care.